Welcome to the Steady On podcast, where God's hard truth meets your hard story. I'm Angie Bauman, and this is episode 117, Shame and Honor. And along with me today is podcast host and evangelism instructor, JC Schroeder. When an opportunity opens up for me to interview a man on the show, I always want to both lean in and run away. I had misgivings about interviewing JC. His bio says he teaches courses on New Testament Greek, hermeneutics, biblical theology, and bibliology. He holds a MA in biblical exegesis in Old and New Testament studies from Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. Now, I've been a local church pastor for closing in on 2 decades, so none of those terms are unfamiliar to me. But I also don't usually enjoy conversations about Jesus with academically trained theologians. Why? Because I judge. I'm so quick to judge. I've had pretty harsh encounters and some painful experiences because people like that sometimes talk down to people like me. I don't like to argue, debate, or even discuss Jesus with an academic perspective. And so I wondered and probably assumed, if I'm completely honest, if JC would like me, and pretty much doubted that he would. But friend, was I wrong? Well, I think I was. He seemed to like me, and I really liked him. He was not at all arrogant. He was humble and gracious and kind. And God taught me something about how I continue to drag past pain into current relationships and about what I'm missing when I refuse to leave the past behind me. So I'm so excited for you to meet JC. He is all those things that I mentioned already, and all of them are good. But he's also an open-hearted student of the Word. And since I love the Word, I also love others who love the Word. JC and I start talking about the roles of shame and honor and what they play in our society, and we move into the invitation for us to follow into Christ's example of humility. The verse for today's episode is one JC mentions multiple times as we chat. It's Mark 10:45 and says in the NIV, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." It's hard to choose humility and service in a world that calls us to take up space and make a name for ourselves. Believe me, I know it's not different inside the church. But I hope listening to my conversation with JC today helps it feel a little bit more attractive, the idea of living in humility. I know that's what it did for me. Let's listen in. Hello, Steady On community, and welcome into this podcast episode. I'm Angie Bauman, and with me today, my guest is JC Schroeder. JC, welcome to the Steady On community.
Thank you, Angie, for having me on. I'm super glad to be with you.
I'm so excited to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to this for a while because we're going to talk about shame, which is something we talk about here quite a bit in the Steady On community, because a lot of us who have any kind of hard story in our past, or maybe the enemy likes to use things that either we've done wrong or we perceive that we've done wrong, or maybe our reaction to something that happened in our life to just like, he just likes to camp on that and try to convince us that now we're not worthy. And carrying that burden of shame can be such an obstacle in receiving the abundance that Christ offers us. So we talk about shame quite a bit, but we've never talked about it like this. I never have anyway, about like what a shame culture is and the difference between like the shame culture of the New Testament, if you will, that we're going to dive into, and kind of like how that shapes our views for how we deal with it today. So I'm super excited to have this conversation. Thank you just so much for spending a little bit of time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm super excited too.
I have to ask this really personal question before we get started. What does JC stand for? I have to know.
John Christopher. So
John Christopher.
Yeah, apparently my parents knew that I was going to have spelling trouble. So they're like, we'll just call him JC. It'll be a lot easier.
Do you have spelling trouble?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. As a writer and a student, you are a seminary student still, and that can be problematic.
Yeah. I struggle with convenience or inconvenience. I still don't know how to spell that word. So I just try to get as close as I can and let
Grammarly sort it out. Yeah. Are you a Grammarly user? I use that for my writing a lot. That's helpful.
I haven't used that, but I've heard good things about it.
I like it. So, well, tell us a little bit about the honor shame culture of the New Testament and how a society's view, what is that, like an honor shame culture, and how does a society's view of honor and shame shape its value system? Just kind of teach us about that for a minute.
Yeah. So honor, shame, all cultures, all societies have some element of honor and shame to them. Ours do, the biblical cultures do as well. But some cultures, more traditional cultures, more Eastern cultures, and the biblical world tend to place a higher level of importance on these concepts of like honor and shame than we might in, at least in our American context. And so the idea behind honor and shame has to do with value and value systems. So if you think of like, what does the community, what does the group, the society that you're in, what values do they have? And what things do they say are profitable, are beneficial, and what things are the opposite of those? And so a person would be valued depending on their adherence to those values, or would be shamed, culturally shamed, by a failure to keep those values. So this is probably like super simplistic way of thinking about it, but the way I think about it is, if you were in a little village and your village was attacked, and you stood and you defended your village and you protected your neighbors, you would be valued and you would be honored among your community. Whereas if you hid and you ran away and you were a coward, you would be shamed in your community because you would be seen as someone with no value, or even like a negative value. And so that becomes a way of how the society would function in trying to encourage people to seek after honor as a way to, I don't know if control is the right word, but the way that a society would theoretically function in a healthy way is that the members of the society need to adhere to these values. So if you adhere to them, we're going to heap lots of honor on you. And if you don't, then you're going to be shamed, or like viewed negatively in our society. And so the Bible has the same sort of cultural dynamic as well. And we do as well, but there's a lot more level of prominence in the biblical world. I don't know. Does that help at all?
No, that's super helpful. I hear fear in what you're describing, and control. I think that is a really good word to use for that, because there's some kind of, when we desire to control, it's a fear-based decision, I think, because there's something that we are nervous about, we're afraid of, we're anxious about happening if it doesn't go the way that we want it to go. And so therefore we'll heap this some kind of shame on, or like there's high stakes, right? There's really high stakes in your behavior that actually reflect on the people, generations back who are deciding this maybe, but we'll heap it on you so that like our way of life doesn't change, or the things that we've decided and stated publicly are important don't change. I don't know. Those are the things that are coming to mind as I hear you kind of describe this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in our society, and in especially the ancient society as well, is that there are those negative connotations, or there could be those negative connotations of the society trying to control and fearing change or something like that. But there can also be healthy dynamics to it as well of, hey, this is really bad for you. Like Paul, thinking of the biblical text here a little bit, Paul at sometimes says like, hey, don't participate in these activities, because this is actually shameful before God. Like this is something that does not bring flourishing in your life. And so he uses that concept of honor, shame, more so of shame, of just saying like, this is not what will bring flourishing to you and to your life. So don't do it. And uses it almost as like as a way of encouraging them to avoid that type of behavior. So there can be positive elements to it, but what frequently happens in society is that we only see the negative aspects of it.
Yeah, which is so interesting, because that's exactly where my mind went immediately. I'm like, I see the negative in this. And I think it's interesting that you point that out, because a lot of times, I think a lot of it starts as maybe well intended. Like I want to create high stakes for this, because I do know, I think of some of the conversations I have with my children as they're growing up. Like, what are the things that I value the most and I think are the most important for you not to do? And so I'm
Mhm.
going to put the most emphasis on those things and well, at least I try to pick my battles wisely, right? And let a whole lot of other things go and pick the things that I want to focus on the most that I think will harm you the most. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Does a story or an illustration from the Bible come to mind to kind of say, here's a place where we see this playing out, sort of this honor shame culture that the people of like Jesus's time are living in?
Yeah. So my favorite one for this, and one of my favorite passages in the Bible, is from Mark 10. And this is when Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem before he's about to be crucified. He's maybe a week before he's about to be crucified. And his thoughts are, he's just very much dwelling on the fact that he's about to go and die for the sins of the world. And as he is going to Jerusalem, he tells his disciples for like the third time that he's going to die, he's going to suffer, and that he will be raised from the dead. And then what Mark tells us the story right after Jesus says all of this, he tells us the story of James and John, Jesus's disciples, coming to Jesus and saying, Jesus, when you enter into your glory, we want to sit on your right hand and on your left hand. And can you set that up for us? JC's loose paraphrase. And Jesus just kind of does the face palm to the head, just like, what are you guys doing? And I was like, can you really, like, can you sit, can you drink the cup that that I'm going to drink, or be baptized? Speaking of like the judgment that he's about
Right.
to experience. And the disciples are like, oh yeah, we can definitely do that. And so their perspective in that request is they are seeking that place of honor. So when they're asking for like the right hand and the left hand, that was the place of most prominence. And there's some Jewish texts from like the Dead Sea Scrolls that talk about when the Messiah enters into his kingdom and has this great feast, the most pure and the most holy will be ones that sit closest to the Messiah. And so perhaps James and John are thinking of like, we're really great and we want the best place of honor because we're so great. So can you set us up? And Jesus, what he does is he flips that entire narrative of the honor shame culture. And so the Lord speaks into that particular culture, and he affirms part of it, but he also flips it in its narrative a bit, because the way that what Jesus says right after this to his disciples is that it culminates with this line when he says this, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so he's describing himself and his own suffering on the cross, is that he, as the Son of God, the one who is deserving of all honor, deserving of all worship, sets all of that aside to serve the world, to serve his disciples, and to die on the cross for them. And so he flips the script, is that, how do I put this? Is that he's the one who should be completely and totally honored, but he takes on that shame for us. And he takes that place of lowest place to serve. And he extends this further, that is the mindset that the believer must have as well, in that it's so easy for us, for myself, to desire a place of prominence, to desire honor, to be like the top dog, to be a person that's just like wanted. And not that those desires are necessarily bad, but that's not the role that the Lord has called us to do, but is to humble ourselves and to serve others just as he has done. And so he's pressing against that idea of where value is. Value is only in if you are this important person or doing things that are of great value. So he's changing the value system. It's not the value system of the disciples or of the Roman world. It's the value system of heaven. And he sees those that humble themselves and serve others as the ones who are truly worthy of honor. So very different than how we think about it, how James and John are thinking about it as well.
I love that you pulled that out, and it made me think about several things. One of the things is I think that that's why both his disciples that were closest to him and also the community at large, and also us today as we follow Jesus. I'm curious your thoughts on this. I think because so often following him doesn't bring us that place of honor, or even like in their time, following him didn't bring them, like it even could have brought them shame because of things he
Mm,
was saying and because of the way that he was choosing to live and the decisions he was making, the choices of humility that he made over and over and over again, when in their society, it was so important to be affirmed and lifted up. And it's different for us and exactly the same, right? Right now, as we're following Jesus and even in our Western culture and in this day, there's so many times that he asks us to follow him and to participate in things and make decisions that are for our, oh, it makes me emotional. They're for our good. They're for his glory. They're absolutely right. They will bring us everything that we desire. But sometimes the world doesn't see it that way. They don't
mhm.
celebrate us. They don't lift us up. They don't affirm us for that. And that creates this tension of, are we really going to find our value and our identity in him and what he says about us? Or are we seeking it in the world? Dang, that's hard stuff.
And like Angie, like I love that when Jesus says this, he doesn't just say like, "Hey, humble yourselves."
Yeah.
He grounds this in himself and
Yeah.
his own actions, because it's not just of you puny humans, you're a nothing and
Mm.
you are worthless, and just take that place of shame.
Hmm.
Like that's
Yeah.
the picture of like the Greek gods. Like the
Hmm.
Greek gods are very much of like, you owe us,
Hmm.
you're going to serve us and you're going to do stuff because we're the gods and you're the humans. But that's
Hmm.
that's not the attitude of the Lord.
Yeah.
It is, our God is one who just, his entire being and essence, the Father, Son, and Spirit, is to pour out love and to give. And you see that fully expressed with Christ on the cross. And you see that of just Christ's character here, is that like, I didn't come to be served, to receive that. I came to give it.
Hmm.
And Jesus is challenging us. And this is why I love the Gospel of Mark so much, and why I love this passage so much, is that it's a challenge for me. It's a challenge for all of us as believers, is that he desires for us to frame our entire worldview and our entire value system and our lives based upon the identity of Christ, and see how he acted. Now we must take on his own his own identity as our own. And that's what is just so um, liberating and powerful for us, is that it is just like, it can be a beatdown in this world. Like you feel as if you are nothing. And the original readers of this text would have felt the exact same thing, I think. And perhaps even more so, because they're were in a very non-privileged position in the Roman Empire. Um, and the Lord, I think, describes just his desire for us to do this, and the honor that he will bestow on us, in our lives and in heaven, of when we follow him. And like you said, this is what brings true flourishing in our lives, of like, this is what is the absolute best for us, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but the Lord knows that it is.
And do we believe that he knows that it is? I mean, doesn't it come
Mhm.
down to that too? Like, I actually
Yeah.
trust you. I believe what you say, and I'm going to live that way, even though sometimes it doesn't make sense to other people. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to me. And yet I feel you and I hear you, and I'm going to follow. We talk a lot today about, as a Christian, the need to live counterculturally. But this just sheds light to me on the fact that to be a Jesus follower has always meant to live counterculturally. I don't
Mm.
think I don't think we think about that as much of the people who were with him, but even the people that are closest to him, maybe especially the people that are closest to him, I'll say it that way, are asked to live very differently with their behavior, with their choices than the people around them. I think, what do you think? I think that's why even his followers gave him such like pushback sometimes. Like, don't say those things, says Peter, right? Or like, I think the story with Judas is betrayal. I think there's so much to that story that we have no idea. I
Mm.
honestly believe that it is possible. I'll say it that way. I believe it is entirely possible that Judas made that decision to force his hand. Like, the way that you're making these decisions is not the right way. And so I'm going to force you to show up and be the Messiah that you say that you are, instead of anticipating that Jesus then would actually, as you're saying, accept the punishment for us, just like, because it never crossed their mind that you're actually going to go through with living this way and being a servant and being a sacrifice. Even though we see you riding into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey, we see you washing our feet, and yet somehow we're like, you're not really going to let that be your final answer, right?
Yeah. And even like, I just been living in Mark lately, and like, in the way that Mark tells the gospel story is a lot, it seems as if many of the disciples get that Jesus is really important,
Yeah.
that he has this messianic identity. Like, this is what Peter says, you are the Christ.
Right.
And then, like, Jesus explains, this is Mark 8, Jesus explains what the Christ is actually going to do. And it's different than what Peter's expecting. He's expecting, like, you're going to ride into Jerusalem, you're going to kick some Roman butt,
Yep.
and we're going to conquer, and we're going to win. And then Jesus describes his suffering, and Peter takes him aside, like, that ain't going to happen
Talk
to you.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
And then
have to be
Jesus
quiet.
responds. His
Yeah.
response is crazy, because he goes, get behind me, Satan.
Yeah.
You're setting your mind on the things of God, not on the things, or setting your mind on things of man, not the things of God.
Yeah.
And that idea of viewing, I don't know, just having the wrong conception of who Jesus is and his identity.
Yeah.
Jesus sees as like satanic, and like, no, we really just need a greater grasp of who Christ is, and how it influences our lives. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that about like your mind and your thought patterns, because how does this idea of like value and identity, if we're able to shift, if we desire to shift and think less of like being affirmed by the world and more of the fact that affirmation actually comes from servant and humility kind of mindset, how do our thoughts need to change? So just like in our daily interactions with people and the things that come up in our real lives, how do you experience your thought patterns changing as you explore this? How would you invite us to consider our thought patterns changing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, the Lord's still working on me, and I'm still trying to
Amen.
figure
Yes.
part of that out. So I don't know if I have the answer, but the thing that I have just really appreciated in the last year, 2 years, in thinking about this subject, is just the story of Jesus and how he models this. And I don't know, I guess the way that I've read scripture, and this is not a bad way to read scripture, but just in kind of like a line by line, here's something I need to do, and then I try to do it. And I think that's good and healthy. But what I've just really appreciated is just seeing the Lord enact this mindset in the gospel story. And so just I've been soaking myself in the gospel, and just of how he lives this out. And the more that I can kind of like have the scripture and the story of Jesus shape my own thinking and my own, like, even imagination, if you will, hopefully that changes my inner processes. So it becomes less of a rule based of like, I need to be humble, or I need to serve, to this is how Jesus acts. Look at the way he acts. Look how he treats the man with leprosy. Look at how he views these poor and afflicted people. I want to live like that. And I think that has been helpful for me. And yeah, hopefully that's been changing me in my life. But yeah, I think it's been helpful. And then that gives more resonance to when we read those commands, those specific passages, do these things, don't do these things. It helps back up those ideas, like, oh, these are the reasons why, because I have such a beautiful and rich and wonderful God who lives this out. I too want to follow his lead, if you will.
Right. Yeah. It becomes less of, I don't have to think about what I need to do here. I have to think about the one that I serve, and then I know what to do here. Like, there's not a checklist in the Bible for every situation that we will encounter. but there is an example in the Bible for every situation we will encounter, right? Because there's the heart of the one that maybe isn't staring at the same situation that we are, but yet he is, through knowing him, we know what to do. The more we know him, the less I think I struggle with what to do. Not the less I struggle to do it necessarily sometimes. Although I think that's true too, actually, because I do desire to honor him with my life. And so I do think that my mind has changed and evolved so much over time as I try to care about the important things and those things that are important to Jesus. Those are the things that need to be important to us as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you think that the idea, going back to honor and shame, how do you think that plays out in our relationship with Jesus? Like, how does you've talked about kind of how he models it. How do you think that we maybe in the idea of honor and shame approach him, or could approach him differently, or receive him differently? Does that question resonate with you? Does that make sense what I'm trying to ask there?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. No, that is a very good question. I think it has to do with one of our value of him. I was
Okay.
thinking about this other passage in Psalm 29, and maybe this is like there's two parts to kind of this question, but maybe the first part is this passage I was thinking about in Psalm 29, where it talks about ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. And that word glory could also be translated as honor.
Mm.
So it's in that wheelhouse of this honor shame culture. And when I hear that passage as an American, I think of wrongly, but I think of God as like almost being needy, like he needs me to glorify him. And that creates a very odd dynamic and an odd relationship um, with him. Like,
Yeah.
in my relationships with my wife or with friends, if I feel like I have to give them some sort of affirmation, it doesn't come across as like affirmation or joy.
Right.
It just comes across as me checking a box. I think what is envisioned in Psalm 29 is how we value the Lord, is to give him the value of who he is, to see him as who he truly is, to recognize, wow, Jesus, the Father, the Spirit is just so wonderful, is so beautiful, and is so loving. And we want to delight in his holiness, in his righteousness, and in his justice. And I think that's the idea of giving God glory, is recognizing him and honoring him and giving him the value, recognizing the value that he truly has. And I think that can really change our conception of God and our relationship with God, is that he's not some egotistical monster that just needs me to affirm him, is that he is a God who is so wonderful, and he desires that to enter into this wonderful relationship with me. And so he desires that we would have this just intimate relationship. And so he desires, and I should just value him as who he truly is. So I think that's the idea behind Psalm 29 in this of how do we value the Lord? How do we honor the Lord?
And how do you see him honoring us instead of shaming us? Like, as we
Mhm.
continue to just talk about this, where does that come from, or what is that like in our relationship with him? We honor him, and how do we feel honored by him?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think there's a couple of different ways. So, number one, we can know that the Lord will honor us, that the Lord delights when we obey him, when we enter into this relationship with him, and we live our lives the way that he desires. One is that we see of how the Father honors the Son. I'm thinking of like Philippians chapter 2, after Jesus's death and resurrection, it talks about how the Father honors the Son in placing him next to him in heaven. But also just thinking of like those terms, like in the Sermon on the Mount, and even in like James chapter 1, blessed is the one who is obedient to the Lord. And so you have like those, the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit. It's talking about the idea of like, that's where true flourishing is found. And that is where of how the Lord desires to just work on our lives and bring true flourishing to our lives when we orient our lives according to him and to his value standards. And I think it just comes down to, I don't know, maybe this is just the way I think about it. It just of that delighting in each other in our relationship with the Lord. And when we delight in him, he also is delighting in us, and he loves to work in our lives to bring flourishing in our lives. I think sometimes we can think of it as that like we're going to get stuff, and that's not necessarily the case. That may be, but it's not a promise from the Lord that we're going to get stuff by being obedient. But we will find that true mode of living, the way that he desires to live, that he desires for us to live when we follow him. And he works that in our lives, in our external lives, in our inner lives, and even looking forward to when we will be fully united with him in heaven, is that that we'll just have that intimate union that we have with him now fully realized with him in heaven.
I tell you what you just said just strikes me. So it's so beautiful. When we delight in him, he also delights in us. I love that. I think that's just such a beautiful way to talk about this intimate, connected, abiding relationship that he offers us. It's just great. JC, I've learned so much in the time that we've been chatting, and I wonder, you have mentioned a lot of scripture. I know scripture is really important to you. We've talked about Mark 10 and Psalm 29 and Philippians 2, and I'm wondering, is there one of those, or is there something else that really is kind of a theme verse or something that just maybe a favorite of yours as you teach and learn more about the importance of this delighting in him, or this honor shame relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that passage in Mark 10 about honor and shame. That's my go-to passage.
Gotcha.
And I love that one. In terms of just delighting the Lord, I love Psalm 1. I've been thinking about Psalm 1 for a while, and there the specific term that's used is delighting in the law of the Lord, but related to the law of the Lord is the Lord himself. And so I love that psalm. That's a really great one for delighting in him.
Thank you. Yeah, I like that. I love that one too. Before I let you go, I ask this of all my guests, and I want to ask you also if you will share any resources with us that might be something that's important to you right now. Anything at all, JC, that you are reading, watching, listening to, studying that's keeping you connected with God right now?
Yeah, I'm reading a book very slowly, but I'm reading a book called, what's it called now? You Are What You Love. I think that's the title, by James K.A. Smith. And just talking about the habits that we have and the formative nature of those for our relationship with the Lord. And it's been very
that sounds like a stepping on my toes kind of book, actually.
Yeah, that's why I'm really slow in it, because it's too convicting, but it's really good. Yeah, I really have been enjoying it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. Again, I want to just remind our listeners that JC can be found at bitesizeseminary.com, and your podcast is called Bite Size Seminary. Give us just a brief overview. What's your podcast? What does it focus on?
Yeah, so it's just all things that relate to the Bible, ministry, theology, and just how we follow the Lord. So we cover a lot of different topics, and we just, as we're recording this now, I just had a few episodes on the canon of the Bible, how we know which books are in the Bible. So we talk about a lot of different topics like that.
I love that. And I love the idea of bite-sized seminary. That's just wonderful. So again, JC, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing yourself and your work with us. And friend, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, peace. JC, thank you again so much for spending time with us today. I loved your heart for the Lord and your insights into his word. To hear more from JC, be sure to find his podcast, Bite Size Seminary. Isn't that a great name for a podcast? Mark 10:45 again, this time from The Message. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage. Next week, do I have a conversation to share with you? Mel Hyatt and Pam Canali will be my guests to talk about how we, the church, can actively support single moms. If you've ever been or known a single mom, hello everyone, right? You will not want to miss what they have to share. Have you downloaded the Covered podcast miniseries? Susie Crosby, my co-host for the bonus Bible Talk episodes, of which you'll find one this Friday on Mark 10:45, joined with me to put together this mini-series that focuses on promises of hope found in Scripture that speak to heavy hearts. Steady On friend Haley Wood also joins us for 2 of the episodes. The link to that mini-series is in today's show notes. It's free. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.